Hey traders, Raghi here, and in this video I'm going to walk you through how a currency trader would look at earnings. And yeah, why would a currency trader look at equities earnings? And the reason is, especially considering the way the equities markets, the Nikkei, the Nasdaq, the S&P, the Dow can all affect the overall risk environment, and that risk environment can affect how some of the currencies are moving. So I typically look at equities in many ways like the tail that wags the dog. The currencies markets are much larger, and oftentimes it's the currencies that'll affect what's going on in the equities markets. But during earnings season, especially when certain key earnings are being released, we have to remember that the equities markets can be a whole lot more impactful. So what do? Well, you actually start to look at individual names. So think about the heavier weighted stocks within certain indexes, whether it be S&P, the Dow, the Nasdaq. Think about what these individual names mean to those. So I think I typically focus on the top 10. And so I've just highlighted some of these. So let's talk about what these mean and why I've highlighted them. So we have tomorrow Apple after the close, and that's probably going to be one of the more talked about earnings releases. But 3M is the heaviest weighted stock in the Dow, and I think it's actually going to be, in many ways, probably overlooked because just Apple is just such a psychologically impactful name. But Procter & Gamble is pretty impactful in terms of weighting. Not as heavy as 3M or Apple. Apple's the number one weighted stock in the Nasdaq. Apple is the number one weighted stock in the S&P. And you think about the way the overflow from the Nasdaq speculative tech weighting into the S&P, which is quite heavy in tech, and then how the Apple spillover even affects the Dow, being about 4.25% of the Dow, and just the way the S&P and the Dow have a 80+% correlation. So I think about, again, all those names that can have impact. So what else could we look at? Well, there's Boeing, there's United Tech, there's Facebook, and you think about the weighting, especially Boeing, which is almost 5% of the Dow. You think about Facebook, which has weighting in not only the S&P, coming in at about 1.5%, but it's the fourth heaviest weighted stock in the NAS at just over 5%. So I'm focusing on the top 10. Amazon, you can see here Thursday after the close. So every one of these, this is a pretty intense week when it comes to earnings. Exxon, major weighting in the S&P. Can't forget that. So these are the things that start, and Chevron is another one to keep an eye on. So these are things that I keep in mind because they ultimately are going to possibly be events that will affect the overall risk environment. And then what happens to equities then will affect commodities and especially commodities sensitive currencies. So now that I've looked at the calendar, and this is pretty important during earnings season, I'm going to think about the inverse relationship right now between the Dow and the dollar. The very reason the Fed could hold off hiking rates, and I think that despite the fact that the inflation numbers are looking better, the Fed will probably hold off. Fed fund futures are not suggesting June is even a probability at the moment, although that could change in just a few words. The Fed on Wednesday, right now, it's not looking that that's the case at all. So more downward pressure in the dollar could be caused by a much more accommodative and cautious Fed, and that's going to help the equities markets. Equities markets rally. I look for maybe the yen to get back on track, but I look for Australian dollar strength, Canadian dollar strength, even maybe New Zealand dollar strength, commodities to strengthen. This is the relationship that we look for. So can earnings have an impact? Absolutely. Absolutely. So what I'm going to do for the pro leaders is we're going to actually take a look at some of these equities names. I'm going to talk a little bit more about weighting. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I might be interested in doing in terms of some of these names and positioning myself and how they relate back to their most relevant and larger index weightings like Facebook, Amazon, and Apple especially. 3M tomorrow, I think, could really set the tone for the open. Again, it's one of those names that may not be talked a lot because on the same day 3M comes out, so does Apple. So the media is going to be much more infatuated with the story that is Apple, but 3M is going to set the tone for the open without a doubt. Number one weighted stock in the Dow. So these are the ways that a currency trader respects equities, can trade equities and the index that they're most correlated with and affect the most. But then also think about the impact, the ripple. Like I like to think about the markets as like dropping a pebble in a pond and the ripples go out 360 degrees. This is just a singular event, like Apple. But could the ripples go out in many different directions? Absolutely. And that's what I love about looking at the markets as a currency trader. So this is how this currency trader looks at a very busy earnings week. Some major names to watch. And those are just some of the more significant ones, but there's a lot of others that could be needle movers.